check and make sure that there's no more buses coming. And then I'll wait for you.
You have to open up the back rows again.
I hope so. I hope so.
Yeah.
Remind people to turn off their phone.
Time off the back rows. They may have I know. Maybe I get into that house. You know what my I know I'm gonna ask. I'm gonna ask. I do, Francie. How are you? I live with you now. Oh, you are? Oh, thank you. But you look well. I wonder what happened to you when you disappeared. Well, maybe after we go. Yeah. It's been so long. That's Francie. Haven't seen her yet. Good to see you.
Y'all ready?
Good evening. Good evening, neighbors and friends. My name is Sandy Clunas,
It's my pleasure to serve on the curriculum committee of the Keese School, one of my favorite activities, scouring for the best and the finest in the community to come and share with you, and we've done that tonight. Dr. Naomi Collins holds a PhD in history, has taught American history and Western civilization at the university level. She served as the executive director of the Maryland Humanities Council and of the National Association of International Educators. She has lived, worked, and traveled abroad in Turkey and Jordan and England and Europe and in Russia for more than 3 years over different decades. That is the background for her book, Through the Dark Days and White Nights. We'll hear tonight how, as a graduate student, she first experienced Russia, and in 3 visits later, her view was then as the wife of the United States ambassador himself here, James Collins, graduate of Harvard, master's degree in history, and a certificate from the Russian and Eastern European Institute. He studied at Moscow State University and conducted archival research and became a professor at the U.S. Naval Academy, where he taught Russian and European history, American government, and economics. After joining the Foreign Service, he served in the office of the Consulate General in Turkey and later at embassies in Moscow and Jordan, returning here to Washington, where he held many positions at the State Department. He was then reassigned to Moscow as Deputy Chief of Mission in 1990 and served in that capacity with 3 ambassadors, as charge d'affaires and acting ambassador. Following his return to Washington, he was in 1997 named ambassador to Russia by President Bill Clinton, serving until 2001. Please silence your cell phones and help me welcome to Asbury's Keese School, Naomi and James Collins. Use the microphone.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. I'm used to not filling a room this size. I'm so glad to see you all. I thank you all for coming, and it is really an honor and a pleasure to be here and to see probably some familiar faces here. I'm just curious, before I begin, how many of you have traveled in or been in Russia? Ah, that's very helpful to know. I can't get away with anything here, can I? Okay, and then how many of you have served in a career in international work? A lot of people there too. Okay, well, then we know who we're talking to now. Okay, so here we are. Well, one thing I know, and do raise your hand if I lose track of my microphone, by the way. One thing that we all know is that Russia never disappears from the news. This has been true for decades. The stories move from page to page, from the front section to the business section to the art section and style section, and back to the front page again. But there have certainly been dramatic changes in some areas, as we know, and continuity in others. I used to say, whoops, whoops, is this what we want? Darkness? Okay. I used to say, and I sometimes thought, that the end of the Soviet Union, starting in 1991, almost 34 years ago now, was hopeful and heralded real change. But as we gather today, it's clear that there's nothing cheering going on now, and it's not clear where that hopefulness might come from moving forward. While history doesn't repeat itself, I do sometimes feel now the same chill I wrote of experiencing in the 1960s when we first lived in Moscow, in the dormitories of Moscow State University, MGU, for those of you who have the language, when we arrived as graduate students in 1965, almost 60 years ago. I'd like to say I was only 12 at the time, but I was actually a graduate student. The feeling of isolation from the rest of the world, the sense of being in a place that's sealed off from the whole world, the secrecy, the repression, the fear, the intrusion by authorities, a kind of darkness, which seems to have fallen on us now. It affects everything. That feeling did for me, in any case. And we returned to live there at intervals over the next more than 4 decades. And somehow, without taking to drink. One thing I noticed early on were the distinctive aromas, the smell of the place, each time we returned. And I think that's true for many places we go. We recognize the familiar smells. I'll read you a short passage on that topic. Long after other remembrances of living in Moscow faded, the distinctive smells of the city, of the corridors, kitchens, streets, and metros remained. On each return, the smells triggered recollections and a sense of place far more quickly than the sight of the Cyrillic alphabet and sounds of the Russian language. These were hardly the aromas of Proust's remembrances of his childhood, the sweet little cakes and mother's perfume. The shared kitchen in the dormitory had reeked of foods that were cleaned in the sink, boiled on the stove, left on the table, trashed. Onions, cabbage, sometimes beef, fish skins, scales, and guts left in the sink. Foods in the kitchen, as in the food shops, sitting at room temperature, became pungent in their distinctive types, exaggerated reminders of milks, cheeses, meats, fish, vegetables. There was no refrigeration at that time in the shops or the dorms. Or the homes. I thought it would be useful to write about what it felt like to live there at intervals, being in Soviet Russia in the 1960s and 70s, and then in post-Soviet and Russia's major transformations of the 1990s into the 21st century. So over these decades, I took to writing. First, on a manual typewriter, then an electric one. And you all remember those. When we speak to some audiences, people say, "What is that woman talking about?" Finally, to word processing. Although I was trained as a historian, I decided not to write a traditional history or account of Russian government, but on observations and reflections on life there as lived by the Russians and by us as foreigners living in Russia. And living there over those decades, another funny thing happened. I got older. Not only did I change perspectives and roles from graduate student to wife of ambassador without changing husbands, but also generations. When we left for Russia in 1965, I thought of my grandmother every time I saw an old woman, a babushka, shoveling snow in the below-zero winter cold, or scrubbing walls and floors on the metro train platforms. Now, of course, I see the world as a grandmother myself. So what I saw, perhaps what we all see, changed with my own decades as well. While our story began with our journey to Russia by train, first boat, then train, in 1965, the book itself opens with a climax to our experience in Russia, the dramatic attempted coup in 1991, and what it felt like to be witnessing it up close and personal with Jim in charge of all Americans in Russia, the chargé, absent an ambassador, and wondering about my own fate and Jim's, watching tanks roll by right outside our windows, just as close as the nearby street. But I'll leave that for you to read in the book or to listen to the podcast recently made by a young historian in Portugal who was so intrigued by the story he decided to make a YouTube podcast of it. For those of you in international work or who are interested more in Foreign Service life, I have a little story here too, the one other reading, of a state dinner that we attended in a very special place. Just have to find the page. So, there was an unexpected summit conference that was called New Year's New Year's Eve, 1992, going on 1993, when we learned suddenly that President H.W. Bush and President Yeltsin were unexpectedly going to have their summit conference in Moscow because their plane would be rerouted because of, believe it or not, icy conditions in the airport they were to land. I'm not sure why that would surprise people at New Year's in Russia, but in any case, the meeting ended up being in Moscow, and as part of these events, you need to have a formal state dinner hosting your hosts and hosting your guests. So Saturday night state dinner was held at one of the palaces within the Kremlin walls. The Kremlin walls contain all sorts of magical things, as you've probably seen. The palace made of faceted walls, the Granovitaya Palace. This is a 15th century hall, and the dinner was there. It was the Parliament of the Noblemen, the Russian House of Lords, you might say. And during dinner, President Bush and President Yeltsin toasted me. This was something that at the time felt very unreal also. Anybody like that, tipping the glass toward me. The courses included all kinds of food, which I could list, but it would probably make you all incredibly hungry, so I won't. But it was an amazing meal with about a lot of courses. There were singers, there were dancers, there was wine and champagne for each course, first-rate musicians, big band entertainment. But beyond the food and drink, the music and dance, the power that was displayed in history, I was haunted by the vision of Ivan the Terrible murdering his own son in that very room. I imagined the floor under my feet absorbing the blood and the walls sustaining echoes of their last cries. Obviously, a very mixed experience. The book ends with some reflections on what I learned from witnessing these scary times up close and personal, as I mentioned, about how different experiencing history is from studying, researching, or teaching history. I realized, first, this is how history happens. When you're living through it, you can't turn to the last page and see how it all turns out. And in fact, you don't even know at the time what is happening at the time. Also, second thing, was it didn't seem as if there were abstract forces of history at work. We always, often in studying history, people talk about the forces of history. It didn't seem like forces. It seemed like actual people making actual choices in real time. Took a lot of people. Third, I realized you can't predict what's coming. No one had predicted this attempted coup, no matter what they tell you today after the fact. Oh, I always knew it was going to happen. No, they really didn't, and nobody really had pinned any particular time to something like this occurring. Fourth, I discovered that one charming muse of history is serendipity. The coup leaders, the leaders of the coup attempt, not capturing Yeltsin at the beginning of the coup. The Russians in the CNN satellite tower not obeying the orders to stop broadcasting, and other chance events. And finally, I learned that it's easier to believe a movie when it imitates reality than reality when it imitates a movie. It's sure easier to predict the past than the future. So we can pick up here with a few comments by Jim about how he saw things as we departed Russia and as he left the Foreign Service in the beginning of this century. And then, of course, with whatever questions or comments you all have after that. I'll look forward to hearing what's on your minds, too. Thank you.
Okay, is this on? Yes, take it. I like to follow Naomi's discussion because I happen to think.
Mouth, hold close to your mouth.
No, I was, okay. I much value Naomi's remarks and what she has written, because in many ways, what has been most important to me about Russia is how much doesn't change. When I left Moscow in 1990, in 2001, I think most everyone thought we had a new partner in what I would call the Euro-Atlantic world. Gone was the Soviet system. Gone was the Russian Empire of 400 to 500 years. Gone was the economic system known as communism. And instead, we had a Russia 10 years into an experiment in converting itself into a market economy, quite successfully, a representative sort of democracy government, and a European partner that had not been such for at least a century. So there was a great deal of optimism, I think, as I left, that the three revolutions that had taken place and brought this country to where it stood had great potential to carry us forward. And I have to say, it's been one of the great disappointments of my life that in the last 20 years that has not happened. The question is, why is that? And I only want to give you a few thoughts, and then we'll go to questions. One of the thoughts is that really struck me at the time I came back. Simply it revolves around the fact that the Russians never thought they lost a war. We talked about the Cold War, and we thought we won a war. And the Russians never thought they lost a war. They thought they had made decisions to change their system, and if you will, join the rest of what they sort of thought of as the Western world. So they didn't understand why America thought they should not be, and continue to be, the other superpower and jointly work with us to shape the future of this Euro-Atlantic world and perhaps the global system. I have to say that our own leadership didn't see the world that way. We tended to see it as Russia was a defeated system, and Russia was not the major power. And in the decade of the 2000s, we largely saw them as a declining power. So that was one, I think, big mistake that we made. Simply in not managing a Russia that was down, admittedly, very much, but did not see itself as having lost. The second thing I think we failed to do was to decide that in this new world, we had to find a way to bring along, both Russia and the rest of its new state neighbors as part of this Euro-Atlantic community and give them a role in that world that was commensurate with the kind of political system that we would hope to see for the whole region. Instead, we decided that we would rely on NATO and a Western alliance to shape that future and basically insist that the eastern half would have to follow. And they chose not to. And I think we have paid a major price for that. And finally, I think the third aspect that is out there that is one of very great importance that was in a way at the foundation of many of our difficulties with the Russians and its neighbors over the last 20 years was the idea that if they had basically decided that they were going to become market economies and capitalist countries, inevitably democracy would follow. There is recently in the news something called the New Long Telegram, written by a young man that worked with me, in which he points out that just changing the economy doesn't change a society necessarily. And that was certainly the case in Russia and much of its neighborhood, the old Russian Empire. And so the emphasis that we put on essentially ensuring that Russia became a market economy, a successful capitalist country, and that all else would follow, I'm afraid left out many of the things that we might have decided needed attention along with economic change if you were going to have a successful outcome. And I'm afraid that Mr. Putin is a result in many ways of some of the more standard and lasting qualities of the Russian history. And we did very little to do, in our part, it seems to me, at a critical juncture, to do what we could to shape a different possible future, both for him and for his country. So I think we have a difficult time ahead with the Russians. They are not going to go away. And I think in that way, it is very important that Naomi has written a book like this that emphasizes the fact that Russia has centuries of history behind it and a culture developed over those times that simply doesn't change easily or quickly, and that has to be given due consideration as we try to find ways to cooperate or to reach absolutely essential decisions that we must make together. So I'm just going to leave it there, and I'd like to just take questions, I think, for Naomi and me. Now, how do we see who's going to go? Oh, okay.
That's better. Now I can see you all, even those who are awake. Yes.
Ushers?
Ushers.
Oh, I see.
with your long experience in Russia, I'd like you to put yourself in the place of Russian leaders now. What do you think they're thinking about us in Washington, D.C. now?
Yeah, I would just venture a guess that there are a lot of leaders in the world who are kind of trying to figure it out.
Yeah. No, I think they are probably watching us and asking, why are we doing this? You know, why are we behaving in a way at the moment that seems not to be maximizing our opportunities with Western Europe and other allies in Asia, but looking inward? And I'm sure they're totally bemused by things like Greenland and the Panama Canal. But I mean, I think they must wonder, what does this mean for Europe? I mean, are we abandoning Europe? Are we leaving Asia to China? I suspect they're very much uncertain about just what this does mean. On the other hand, they do not forget that we're the other major nuclear power.
Thank you very much. So if you were to sit down together and come up with another long telegram for the next 30, 40 years, proposed strategy for the United States vis-a-vis Russia, your thoughts, please.
What would it say? Well, I happen to have one particular tack that I don't hear or read about anywhere. And I will simply give you this as a thought. There are 6 time zones to the east of the Ural Mountains. And there are 30 million people living in it. And in one province of China, south of the Amur River, there are 100 million Chinese citizens. Now, this is Russia's future problem. What are they going to do to develop the rest of their country in the years ahead and decades ahead? And so one of my thoughts, frankly, regarding the future of the Western community's approach to Russia would be to say, we can leave this to the Chinese and you, or we can talk with you, Russia, as another European nation and your neighbors close to you, about how that region can stay within your orbit and be developed. Seems to me that's the one thing we have to say now that is one within the power of the Western American and European economies, and also something that the Russians must confront. And even Putin has talked about this. And I will simply say to you that I think it is a hard sell for Mr. Putin to tell his people to see the Chinese as their friends.
In 1965, with The World as Your Oyster, you made the decision to go to Moscow to study. Did you have any idea of what that was how that was going to impact your future life, or what made your decision? What was it that made your decision?
Well, maybe I should answer that, but as well. Is this turned on? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Jim's decision and mine came from different places. Okay. His decision came from the fact that this was his academic field of study. This was his academic interest from high school through college and graduate school. Russian history, economics, government, and language, and he spoke it fluently. So it made sense when the US government offered us an opportunity for the paid, they paid for the opportunity to spend a year living in the dormitories at Moscow State as part of an exchange program that had just been started in the late 50s. It was a unique opportunity. I was not in the field of Russian history. I'm in the field of European and American history. And I was a graduate student at the time, but I was also married to Jim. So I had the option of not going, which several of the wives also chose to do at that point. Almost all the graduate students were men, even in my field. But I thought, well, that'll be an airplane ticket, well, a boat and a train ticket to get us to Europe, and then I'll be in Europe, I can do something else afterwards. And it'll be interesting, it'll be different. So I went mainly to accompany Jim, and then in return, I got a year in London afterwards to do my own thesis research for it, partly at the expense of the program. But for Jim, the interest in Russia came very early, and probably could say in a sentence or two of how he even got into the study of Russia. Like, why would someone in the 1950s think to do that? You want to say in a couple of sentences?
Well, I could tell you two things. First of all, it was very interesting because in that year, there were exactly 18 of us, graduate students and young faculty.
Americans, yeah.
Americans in the entire Soviet Union. And there was one American company in Moscow. American Express had a one-room office in the Metropole Hotel. And that was it. And other than that, there was the embassy and some journalists. But I went most of all because, frankly, at that time, if you had any interest in Russia and wanted to do anything there, the only way you could go was on something like this government exchange. And if I wanted any career that would do anything or ever take me to Russia, I thought it had to be with the government because no one else was there. So that was how it was. Now, how did I get into this crazy field? Essentially, as a junior in high school, I was a music student, and I worked with a man who was a conductor of the best amateur orchestra in Chicago. And one of the concerts he put on was the prologue and coronation scene from Boris Godunov, the opera. And I got to play the bells. And that started it. It got out of hand.
So that was a really good question.
Mr. Ambassador, there's been a book come out recently by Hal Barnes, who's sitting in the Kissinger chair at SAIS, School of International Studies at Johns Hopkins, about the world continent, the Eurasian continent, and how it's gone through three world wars. First World War, the Second World War, and the Cold War. And that now we are in the early stages of the fourth. And I wonder if you agree with that assessment, and secondly, if you accept the proposition that the hinge of how that war is going to proceed is taking place now in Ukraine, and that if it doesn't turn out to Russia's disadvantage and successfully deter them from proceeding, that the next step will be Taiwan, and then the Russian nation want to take second place to China, and what that will lead to. Do you accept that proposition, or do you think that's not a reasonable proposition?
Well, I think Ukraine, after all, if one really steps back and thinks a bit about all of this, the Ukraine war is one of the last dimensions of the breakup of a 450-year-old empire. Now, we thought and we hoped that that empire was going to break up and do so peacefully. And for the most part, it did. But the idea that I think went wrong, and I happen to believe this very strongly, was for the Americans and its allies in Europe to decide that they could rely on an expanding American and West European-based alliance system to surround Russia and isolate Russia so that it could not do anything but accept the inevitable was a mistake. And when the then President Bush Jr. invited Ukraine to join NATO, the ambassador in Moscow, who was a good friend of mine and someone I highly respect, said at the time that this was a terrible mistake because it was going to promote a clash. And I think he was right. I mean, it was a terrible mistake. Now, how do we get out of this, and how do we find a way to reconcile this? I don't think it's inevitable that there has to be a conflict between East and West in the Euro-Atlantic world. As I said, there are many things that we have in common as interests that should give us openings to explore what can be done together. It was done before when you had the Helsinki Agreement between the Soviet Union and the United States. That was a time when everybody thought we had to prevent another invasion of Czechoslovakia. And all agreed. Well, now we need to do the same about Ukraine. We have to find a way out of this and to prevent it ever happening again. But it's going to mean compromises on both sides. Are we ready for that? I don't know. I can only hope we will be so when the opportunity presents itself. Is it inevitable that there has to be a fourth Cold War? No. But I'm not convinced that we will see the wisdom or have the ability to make the decisions that will prevent it. I just hope we can.
I think the gentleman here.
Mr. Ambassador.
I think that there was a gentleman here, and then you'd be next.
Thank you, thank you. And just in my own thinking, I have a certain line of thought. And the bottom line is, who got the money? And I go back to when the Soviet Union broke up, and I think the companies were disbanded, and the workers got a certain number of shares. And certain people at bargain basement prices bought up the shares from those people. Those people then became sort of like a first-line oligarchy. Then in my understanding, Putin came along and just replaced that first-line oligarchy and with his own kleptocracy, and that's where we are. But back to who got the money, who has the money now, and I think maybe the Russian people just never understood capitalism. Now, you being there, what was your opinion about that when the Soviet Union fell?
Well, I mean, it's certainly true that the distribution of the national wealth, if you will, was far from egalitarian. but give me a break, you know, I mean. It was also true that despite all of the kinds of things that were written and a lot of the statistics thrown around, that as I left Moscow in 2001, 70% of the national wealth, as best you could figure it, still belonged to the government. It didn't belong to private citizens or, you know, stocks or whatever. So it had only gone so far, and it had not managed to get really to be a private market economy. Now, you know, it is today a market system, but the government controls a great deal of the biggest parts of it, their natural resources and so forth. Mr. Putin, quite frankly, from my perspective, in the first term as president, was presiding over a sort of multifaceted governmental structure. And he had to promote compromises and make deals with everybody. When he had to get elected re-elected for the first time, he went to the one organization that President Yeltsin had assured was never going to have a major role in his administration. That was the old KGB, the old security forces. And he brought them in, and he basically gave them the ability to make sure he was elected president. And I think from that time on, they have held the sway in the system that is unfortunately very large. And it sort of exceeds the capacity of either the moneyed class, the government bureaucracy, the military. It's the old security structures. And I'm afraid they're the ones that have his ear.
Mr. Ambassador, could you give us your thoughts on the rather bizarre and unnerving relationship between Russia and North Korea?
Russia and whom?
North Korea.
Oh. Well, I mean, I'm not really privy to a lot of the information, but it strikes me quite simply that Mr. Putin is not in a position to go and look like he's in charge if he's talking to the leader of China. But he can go and he can look very much the dominant partner if he goes and talks to Mr. President of North Korea. And North Korea benefits from this by having increased stature. I have no idea what else they're getting from the Russian side. But my sense is the Russian side, after all, in Korea has largely, with the exception of Iran, found itself left with very few open partners. Doesn't mean people aren't buying Russian oil, doesn't mean people aren't supplying Russia with certain commodities and goods. But you'll notice that Mr. Xi does not associate China with his Ukraine adventure. And very few others do either. The only ones who have done so are Iran and North Korea. So in some ways, I would say part of what you're watching is a man with relatively few opportunities maximizing what he can get. And that happens to be North Korea and Iran at the moment, and not a heck of a lot else.
Are there other questions, or are people? What?
Or observations.
Yeah, or observations or comments or anything, because is there someone up there? Oh, okay, I see a couple of people up front. Well, red sweater and then, yeah. Oh, that,
Oh, or-
him, well, both of you in
okay.
turn, maybe.
Oh dear. I just, I wonder about some of the little countries, and I'm not sure how important they are, Lithuania, Estonia, and the very peculiar fact that Russia still has the right to run a train to a little piece of Russia over on the coast. It's all very peculiar. It's not nearly as important to me as Ukraine, but do you have any little observations about that?
Well, I think the principal thing today that gives confidence to the Baltic states is that they are members of NATO. You know, they are members of an alliance that says an attack on one is an attack on all. And the Russians know that perfectly well. The old Kaliningrad district of what was East Germany, Eastern Prussia, you know, has arrangements by which they supply it and they have communications. And nobody is interested in trying to obstruct those specific arrangements. And as long as they don't, I think it doesn't seem to pose a problem. There are a number of such oddities along borders at that part of the world, but so far, it seems to work reasonably well.
Yeah. I wondered if, leaving politics behind for a moment, if either of you had any particular favorites in Russian literature and or Russian film that you've liked.
That's a big one, but you know, having read a lot of the classics, I was thinking though, for some reason, I was thinking now more about the American rather recent book, A Gentleman in Moscow, and that's obviously not a direct answer to your question, but I do think that's it feels very authentic in some way. The writing is beautiful. His name is Tolls, you know, or however you pronounce it. And I just find that an intriguing book, A Gentleman in Moscow. It just feels very real. For other literature, we could probably, you know, go on for a while. Or in Jim's case, music, obviously. Burry's good enough, major in his life, so that matters a lot too. But yes, a whole course in Russian culture is sort of what he did as an undergraduate too. I think there was someone over on this side too. Yes, there you are.
What are the interests of Russia in something like the Wagner Group, which was eventually put down, but was then, and apparently there was some interest of Russia in following up of the activities of the Wagner Group in Russia. Somehow that seems quite a departure from old Russia. What is going on there?
Well, two things I think probably have to be said. One is something like the Wagner Group was put together as a private army, you know, a mercenary army by Mr. Wagner and supported by him and by, incidentally, the so-called GRU, which is the Russian military's intelligence wing. And they certainly were able to do things with leaders in places like some of the African states and so forth that were profitable. You know, they've got paid, for one thing. They were getting hold of natural resources. They were making good money in these places. And they were giving Russia itself a foothold with some of these African countries, which they had abandoned after the Soviet Union collapsed. But Wagner was big business. I mean, Wagner was running a private military organization, and as you remember, he got himself into his biggest problems by, first of all, being a major force in Ukraine, in certain key places, and then complaining that the military wasn't supporting him. It ended up he had an unfortunate flight on an insecure aircraft. But I mean, I think these private military organizations exist. There are a number of them. And they all are money-making organizations for the people who run them. At the same time, they tend to do, let's say, officially unrecognized kinds of work with clients in Africa, Latin America, some places in Asia, and so forth. I would say we also have certain mercenary organizations too. Yeah, I have two people here. And there's one in the back too.
Dr. Collins, could you talk a little bit about how people live there now? Is it even? I know you left in 21. No, before then, much before then.
Well, Jim finished in 2001.
2001. Yeah. But can you talk a little bit about how the women are doing? What is their life now like there?
That is a good question because, of course, I haven't, been there much since. Jim has actually been there for visits several times on business, several times since 2001. But from what we hear from people and hear from people we know, I think probably most of what we'll think of as professional or middle class people are living, what shall we say, better than they were before. I mean, they have private housing, they're able to build housing. I expect from day to day they're living comfortably by their standards too. What's harder to get a handle on, I think, because most of the people we know are at a level that they are meeting with scientists and professors and people there who are living in this sort of equivalent manner, given their location, to what people here are living. But I'm not sure if anyone has written about or knows what, shall we say, less educated people or people with lesser resources are doing, how people are living in the rural areas, whether that's really changed all that much. It was shocking even as the centuries, turned over to see that the rural areas still look pretty much the way they had looked, unpaved and so forth. But we know statistically that the standard of living has gone up there in the sense of maybe more indoor plumbing, or people moving to places that have plumbing, let's just say. When we first went out there, that was not a common thing. Again, we discussed no refrigeration, nothing. Now refrigerators, cars, traffic beyond belief, and so forth. But I'd be interested, and it's a very good question, I'd be interested to know if somebody's written more about what workers and rural people, what their lives are like from day to day, and I'm not really quite sure I can speak to that, though. But a question worth knowing more about, too. Thank you for asking. You've got me interested now in finding out more about today, too. Thank you. And yes, you, behind. Oh.
I'm interested in climate change. And we know that Russia is a big fossil fuel producer. And I know that the climate in Moscow has been interesting in terms of the lack of snow and that sort of thing. But is there an impetus in that country to even enter into any climate agreements? Do you find that from your experience living there, that they have problems that might be such that they would want to go along with international agreements on that?
Well, Jim might be able to talk more to the international agreements. Visually, certainly, in the years we lived there, there were belching chimneys and smoke in the air and a car exhaust without, with lead. I don't know if the lead's gone by now or not, and the fuels and so forth. So, but I don't think the air quality was really tops. But what they're doing internationally in that regard, I'm not, Jim may be able to speak more to that. They didn't worry a lot about pollution, I think, and it was clear visually that they didn't, the air, the water, and so forth. Remember that when we were there, through most of the time we were there, you weren't able to drink the tap water. So you're dealing, with a level of hygiene, shall we say, that was different. And in my book I mentioned, too, during so many of the years we were there, the average medical facilities even might not have had hot water. We didn't always have hot water. So, it was a whole different level of hygiene, shall we say. Also, or public health, I guess would be a better way to put it, health and hygiene, than we experienced. How much it's gotten better, more recently, I can't say, or about the international agreements, I don't know. Do you know about that?
Well, what I do know is a couple of things. I mean, they are aware of certain real issues for them. The most serious being the threat to the permafrost areas of Siberia, where the potential to melt the permafrost can have catastrophic results for things like dams and so forth, if they have. Secondly, there's no question, however, that in European Russia, in Moscow, the winters are nowhere near what they were when we were there as students.
Right.
We had 3 weeks or 2 weeks of weather where it did not get above -40, which is chilly, I can tell you.
And
We never had, in my 4 years, or my decade of the 90s, I never had any weather like that again. So it's changed. Now, the problem in another way for Russia, European Russia, is that's not all bad. It means that certain kinds of crops and other things are now growable in parts of European Russia that were never open to them before. So it's sort of a mixed bag. The Russians are party to most of the major international agreements on climate, but to what extent are they active partners in it? Not so much. Okay.
We understand also that 8:30 is the ending time. So does anyone have something sort of pressing before? Oh my heavens, we do have some pressing questions before the end. Yes.
I have one.
Sure.
I'm wondering about the possibilities of movement in democracy, the Navalny aspects. I'm wondering what your thoughts about that. Is there still remnants of a movement for democracy there? So there's certainly a history in Russia itself, in the Soviet itself, in the Soviet Revolution, and in other mates for that kind of movement. And I'm wondering if there's anything there. And tied to that, to me, is the opportunity seemed to be for American connection to Russia was during the Clinton years. And I'm wondering why that didn't work out.
Well, yeah. I think I would like to say one thing to this audience, because it really has something that has struck me very much in the last few years. And that is that as we think back on the years we were there, in the 60s and 70s, and as I went back even into the up to the 80s, you cannot imagine the degree to which the Soviet communist government totally controlled the information space in which they lived. Nothing got in. I mean, there was the Western press was L'Humanité, the Daily Worker, and a couple of other communist journals. Any shortwave, and it was the only ones there were, shortwave radios were jammed, except for the jazz hour that Voice of America was like. I mean, the communist system had total control of its population's information, and then they had their own education system and their own philosophy and their Marxist-Leninist structure. There was nothing else. Now, all of a sudden, it's an open market. And I watched that it began in the 80s, and by the time the 90s come, it's a circus. I mean, I knew something had changed when I went back the first time in 1987 with the Secretary of State, and I walked down one of the central streets in Moscow, and the first thing I met was a Hare Krishna group. This had not happened when we were there before. So the only thing I say about this is there's no way those controls can come back. So the availability of alternative ways of looking at the world, of seeing the world, of education, of how people behave, of what's possible, are simply a part of life, particularly among the younger generations. When I went in 1991, my first big issue with the Soviet government as the number 2 in the embassy was to get a telephone for the ambassador's car. Now there are 300 million telephones. No. Cell phones. I mean, it's totally uncontrollable at this point. Now, that, I think, has the most profound implications for whether or not this can be a more open society, a more democratically structured one over time or whatever, than anything else we're talking about.
Okay, thank you very much, both of you, Naomi and James. Yeah. There's so much material to deal with, and you did so well. And then the Q&A, I think, really worked well. Thank you for staying with that. Can you stay a little bit afterwards in case someone wants to come down and talk to you? Okay, very good. Well, we had a really good turnout tonight. We're very pleased that the Keese School is rolling along well in our semester. So Thursday night, the title is Live Well to Die Well. Chris Palmer. This talk focuses on preparing for a good death by living well. It will discuss goals, strategies, and tactics for a meaningful, fulfilling, and productive life. Chris will guide reflections on personal values, purpose, self-care, and their influence on life and death quality. It'll be hosted by Kate Harrison. That ought to be an interesting topic. Again, we're going to be back here in Roseboro Theater most of this semester.